Hello, my name is Ian, and today we're talking about Liora Gvion's and Naomi Trostler's From Spaghetti and Meatballs Through Hawaiian Pizza to Sushi, The Changing Nature of Ethnicity in American Restaurants. This is a peculiar article, and I'm not 100% sure whether it's successful, but it's something I really it's one of the things that I like, and I wish it sort of wrestled to the ground in a way, because I really like their methodology. I like what they are aiming at, but I think there's just a couple of things that might be sort of missing from it. So the article is basically, and it's an analysis. We don't find out until a couple of pages in, really, that they are looking at menus, specifically the artifact of the menu as a kind of text, as a entry point, as something that can be parsed, and something that can be parsed in a way out of context, and that's good. I mean, that's not a terrible thing in and of itself, and because they're basically making this statement that it comprises a discrete unit. That yes, that unit is part of a larger complex. And it's, when you are presented with a menu, there is typically someone who presents it to you, who can answer questions about it, so is there to interpret it. There's also a number of people around who can help you interpret it in terms of like your family, or at least not necessarily not help you, but collectively they can come up with some sort of interpretation. There's a context for it. There's the larger restaurant as a stage. And so I don't know how well that can be abstracted from that context, and yet nevertheless it does comprise a discrete unit. So what can we learn? And I think it's not necessarily even an academic exercise, because since it is an artifact, since it is something that can be plucked away as a souvenir or can be deposited in an archive or collected, in a way the menu ought to be able to represent in toto the depiction of the restaurant and what it is trying to accomplish. So and maybe the issue is that ultimately it can't, but what is meant from it? Now, this is where I'm not 100% sure, because I think they suggest that it can be taken away from that. So they are thinking that this constitutes data in a way, that these texts comprise the representation of ethnicity, whereas another group, and I think folklorists being one of them, would see this text as something that really cannot be extracted from that context. Or rather, once you abstract it from that context, it becomes a different thing. And you can see it as an artifact, but you can't necessarily see it as some kind of objective reality. And we don't find out that their method is to go through menus until, I think, like literally the fourth page of this. So it's not until like the bottom of the third page that they let on that their argument is going to be about how these things reflect in menus. And so, okay, once they do that, you're kind of rolling along. The other issue that I'm not certain of is how they are constructing the idea of an American restaurant. The title itself, The Changing Nature of Ethnicity in American Restaurants. I don't think they are talking about a restaurant that happens to be in America. I think they are talking about American restaurant as a category of restaurants that are possible, but like almost a named genre of, or named subcategory of the larger category of restaurant. So they're not talking about ethnicity in ethnic restaurants, quote unquote, that happen to be in America, although they often defer to those. They are thinking about the American restaurant as, I don't know. And that's the issue. The American restaurant as a self-evident thing that is different from these other categories of restaurants. And then this concept of ethnicity has entered into, I guess, the mainstream and an American restaurant is about American cuisine to begin with. And American cuisine is already a problematic idea to the point of a number of different reasons, and they point to various people who've already spoken about this, in that because First Nations foodways barely enter into the consciousness, save for through syncretic cuisines. And again, then their contribution is often silenced. So we do have things like Southern foodways in the United States, and the origins of Tex-Mex, and the using beans as protein, and corn, and so on. That there are very specific and traceable elements of indigenous foodways that has then been syncretized through European colonizer foodways as well, to create this other thing that is not extricable from its First Nations roots, but has transformed into something else. I think you see that even less in Canada. For whatever reason, our colonizer patterns haven't particularly adopted First Nations food, with a couple of very few exceptions, like maple syrup. And so these foods that we actually very much cling to as indicative of Canada, they're much more about landscape, and we're only sort of now mentioning in passing that actually the syrup making process was something that was learned from First Nations people, and that's a history that wasn't present in my childhood. So that's a good thing that is happening, but we can't really sort of point to one indicative food and say, there we do it. Most of the time we're talking about these colonizer cuisines, these colonial cuisines that have adapted to local agricultural practices, local flora and fauna availability, local food, and already participating through trade. We're also talking about this enormous region, Canada, the United States, with multiple different areas of food production and so on, and different colonizer settlement patterns and immigrant settlement patterns. And it's an unfair line that I'm drawing, but the idea of like the hegemonic mainstream access to power, white supremacist states, either English or French, that comprised the sort of the baseline of the first colonial enterprise, and then subsequent communities that had processes of integration, many of them rocky, but entered into this processing of mainstreaming, as it were, that have affected cuisine to the point where one can't, it isn't delineated in the same way that apparently French cuisine is or Italian cuisine is, although again in Italy we would understand it as a series of regions as well. So, but is there such a thing as American food? And I guess that is kind of what they are pointing towards. And they have this interesting ethnographic distance. They're both Israeli scholars, and so as they're immersed in American culture, they do have this kind of outside view that is both fruitful, but I think perhaps lacking in a certain amount of nuance. And there seems to be a certain amount of snark that happens, which maybe that's just me as I'm reading it. If there is such a thing as American cuisine, and therefore there is this thing called an American restaurant, it is adapting. It is adaptable. It is not constant. You can even point to regions of American restaurants, and they make the indication of the East Coast, the West Coast. The East Coast sort of being more adventurous, the West Coast sort of being more faddish, as it were, and then slowly that accretes in the sort of the thick Midwest, and that's where things are last to come. But by the time they're there, you can start to make an argument that that these various new forms have entered into sort of American consciousness and American cuisine cooking. So, and again, I'm going to be prefacing, or I'm going to be reiterating, I think, throughout this. So they have a cool methodology. They have a collection of menus. They don't say exactly how they are collected. Is it a personal collection? Is it archival collections? It's just sort of presented as there are 1,000 ones that we chose from. Because they were already selected in some kind of randomness, then randomness is something that we can enter into, and so they self-select from that list. Let me just double check. Yep, there's no footnote, there's no explanatory comma about the provenance of this collection. They also divide it into regions, and they divide it into decades. And the decade is probably the most useful. The region one seems to be applied inconsistently in some way, at least in their overall discussion, where they're hopping back and forth. And you kind of had the impression that they were going to be talking about Midwest, the central United States, as the as sort of their baseline, and then they're constantly referring to restaurants in California and New York. So anyway, as I said, it's fairly confusing, but they make a couple of interesting arguments, and they sort of go, then they proceed decade by decade, and they start back in the 1960s, where you started to have sort of the idea of some kind of starting from some imaginary baseline of American food. You started to see, for lack of a better word, ethnic influences coming in, but still, it was basically through the provision of a name, through the provision or the introduction of a key ingredient or two, and in a way, it's sort of caricaturish. So, as I say, the ethnic repertoire was found mostly in immigrant neighborhoods. The mainstream, or the white restaurants, as it were, I guess that's their language. I think that's what they are intimating by this. White restaurants seem to have a fairly uniform, syncretic from Northern European tradition food systems on their menus. The kind of like American food, quote unquote, which again, the whole point is that all these terms are problematic and diffuse and vague. Ethnic restaurants were really the provenance of ethnic neighborhoods, and they catered largely to the communities that lived there. They were not where the mainstream, as it were, went to eat, but you started to see influences, and it seemed to be basically, as I said, through the provision of certain ingredients. So for example, the idea of the rosticeria in Champaign-Urbana in Illinois. So again, a Midwestern restaurant. Basically a hamburger, but with variations were served. And so the French hamburger was called the fromage hamburger and had Roquefort. The Cantonese hamburger had sweet and sour sauce and had pineapple, onions, green peppers, and lychee. So basically, literally taking some ingredients and adding them to a variation, but without any real effort at sensitivity, might be the argument that they are making, but really it's just like we're taking a thing and we're adding something from somewhere else. We're not calling it fusion. We are just, it's more like a hamburger a la France or hamburger a la China. And that was sufficient. And again, not aiming at representation, not aiming at explanation, but using basically what language they don't use is sort of using the tourist gaze or the tourist palate of like, oh, here's a French cheese that is on top of this. So some kind of arguments were in place. One thing which I really do like that they discuss in terms of the menu as an artifact is that the menu is a structure. There's a typology of menus. And even where a dish lands on what page of a menu is an indicator of how that food is to be understood. So, because this is the text that we receive, dishes that are on the front page or two, we recognize as starters or appetizers. Ones that are in the thick middle are the entrees. Ones that are towards the end are desserts, or perhaps occasionally sides, but then sides and most likely desserts. So a restaurant is still meeting the expectations of what comprises a meal and how the various components of a meal come together in some kind of temporal sequence. And it's not that all meals have to have these three courses by any stretch, but what it does do is that you need to think about this category of food that we are presenting, or this list of foods that we are presenting as this category of food translated into North America. In the Chinese and Indian examples that they are drawing from as a comparison, again, a little bit ambiguous about their data, but they say one's first impression in Chinese and Indian restaurants was that dishes were grouped according to their major ingredients. vegetables, beef, chicken, fish, chow mein, rice, and seafood. In the Americanized transformation, these classes of food were organized for first, second, and last course. So and on one hand, they imposed this American structure. On the other hand, they introduced these foods through an American structure. So take your pick. I mean, where is it? Imperialism? Is it and capitalization on an ethnic tradition, or is it some kind of implicit pedagogy that's going forward? And is the transformation that happens to this food and to the system of food delivery, as it were, through the provision of a meal and what the meal comprises as an event, is that some kind of devolution by doing it this way? The 1970s, again, for reasons they don't necessarily spill out, but we had the beginnings of the ramifications of a counterculture movement in the late 1960s. You had the beginnings of certain more adventurous eating that then became part of upon which industries were built. And so, the ethnic restaurant, as it were, became a place that people entered into with greater and greater frequency, in part because of a general dissatisfaction with American culture in the 1960s. That foment, that revolt, they started to have a kind of rejection of American food values. And you can read this in other places, and they send a couple of footnotes in that direction. But basically, you had this, it's the same reason that we started to have the rejection of things like white bread, the rejection of certain forms of meat. It wasn't simply a health issue. It was an idea of the inauthenticity or the processed nature of mainstream foodways, and people sought out other forms. And sometimes it was other forms in terms of health, and sometimes it was other forms in terms of less hegemonic cultures, and sometimes the two were married, because the idea is that the hegemonic culture is also providing bad food, literally morally bad, biologically bad, and harmful, and therefore we're going to seek something else outside. But with also that sort of hint of touristic impulse. It's like, well, they are also now available because you had this ongoing provision of the expansion of ethnic neighborhoods and ethnic restaurants, and the ethnic restaurants were building and catering to, they were going through a process. So you can't put one line in the sand, but you had the beginning of this entry. So you go back to their 1970s menus, and basically, that's what they suggest, that there's touristy travels in the 1970s. And I think we can speak about tourism, again, in that classic culinary tourism sense of not simply literally traveling to places, although that does comprise part of it, but also through restaurants, through cookbooks, through television shows that are introducing world cuisines, and the whole apparatus of othering that occurs. A strange sentence, and again, something that makes me sort of take that sort of anthropologist on Mars aspect to it. The presence of immigrants in the business district furthered the introduction and modification of ethnic food because the customers were looking for familiar dishes for their meal break. So I don't know if what they are saying is that as more first and second generation Americans entered into a middle-class workforce, they were looking for familiar restaurants, and that spurred it on. Was the mainstream now less white? And by mainstream being the people who are eating at business restaurants and business districts. And this is where the language becomes so very peculiar. It's peculiar for them. It's peculiar for me to try and parse it. But basically, it's like as there were more and more non-white people or Northern European people in the audience for restaurants, that expanded. And I think they might be right, and I think they might be clumsy as they express it at the same time. But the menus changed, because the menus were less about this harsh caricature of, let's just take a couple of pieces of food that we associate with this ethnic cuisine and just transplanted into our American food. They introduced entire dishes through processes of adaptation, through processes of explanation, through framing, through all the techniques that one does when one introduces it, and little text underneath that provides sort of biographical senses. They contextualize dishes in a setting that explain their origins and the way in which they had changed. And then subsequently, bringing forward national dishes, ingredients, and cooking methods as major distinctive features underlying the fundamentals of national cuisine, then constructed these foreign traditions. This trend propagated changes in Mexican and Chinese restaurants as well. So as these two cuisines became much more mainstreamed, to the point where you could start talking about Mexican-American restaurants and Chinese-American restaurants. So restaurants that weren't simply part of the immigrant neighborhoods, ethnic neighborhoods, but were now access to this thick American middle. All the terms are so problematic. They were constructing this argument of tradition. This is they're making sort of a Hobsbawm's invention of tradition idea, and that they lend these things authority by projecting a history onto them that is in some ways rather indifferent to the actual history. The invention of tradition argument is always kind of snooty, and it builds, it's parallel to kind of Dean McCannell's idea of staged authenticity, because it always turns everything into it reduces everything to some kind of like dominant exploitative class and the people who have to go along with it, as opposed to it removes a certain amount of agency in it. But one of the things that was suggested, and they refer to Cafe Oasis in San Francisco, is the idea that at the same time we see these patterns of ethnicity being brought in, not simply in terms of sort of spears, but dishes being brought in, you also began to see, and maybe this is because it was a San Francisco, their West Coast, their sort of, adventurous immigrant sophisticated, interested in alternative cuisine patterns that they suggest is indicative of the West Coast. At Cafe Oasis, ethnicity was more visible as the restaurateur could assume some previous knowledge and familiarity of his customers. The descriptions of the dishes were concise, and ethnic dishes were an integral part of the menu. So these things were going without explanation, not because people were indifferent to the explanation of these dishes, but because it was assumed that people would already have some kind of intelligence about them. So again, if we're talking about the restaurant as meeting a set of expectations, what the clientele don't know, what the clientele do know, how much do you need to provide, how much can you assume, and how much do you need to guide the clientele through the artifact of the menu. So, and then it's cumulative as restaurants can assume familiarity because their assumptions of their previous assumptions of familiarity have borne fruit and have proven successful. Then they can assume additional familiarity, and it accretes, and so more and more ethnic food can be brought into the American restaurant with the notion that it will be, if not immediately comprehensible, at the very least it would take fewer stages to make it, or fewer steps to make it comprehensible. It can be more quickly assimilated. You know this thing? Well, this is a variation of that. And again, irrespective of whether this is an actual variation of that, if you are familiar with this as a kind of dish, like a stir fry or something, because of your familiarity with Chinese food, you can bring in a food that is not historically related, but structurally related, structurally similar, like say a Thai stir fry, and you go, well, it's just like this, only with different ingredients. And so you have that translation matrix in order to comprehend that much better. In the 1980s, you started to see ethnicity being not played with, as it were, and not in the same way that we'll just take a burger and stick a pineapple on it and call it a Cantonese burger, but rather, deliberate efforts at fusion, at they call it transboundary restaurants. So you not only had these transboundary, which were deliberately taking these things and saying, this is not authentic to either of these traditions, but we are taking French and Italian and bringing them together and creating something new. So it is still adventurous eating, it is still an experimentation with otherness, and yet it is not purporting to be, it is purporting to be honest with its originating traditions, but not necessarily beholden to them in the same way. You also had restaurants that were just, we are an ethnic restaurant, you can come and get ethnic food. So it wasn't simply a matter of, we are now an American Mexican restaurant or a Mexican American restaurant or a Chinese American restaurant. We are a restaurant where a whole bunch of different national cuisines are present, some siloed, some in some kind of fusion way. So the mingling and mixing of cuisines implied a multicultural convention to which traditional hierarchies and culinary patterns no longer applied. I guess their argument is that they were no longer, they being the restaurants, the general trend of American restaurants, were past the point of trying to introduce in its kind of simple ways of, this is what French food is, this is what Italian food is, this is what Chinese food is, and building on that assumption, it's like, okay, now that we have a vocabulary, go and play. So it's kind of like, you come and be adventurous with us, come and transcend these boundaries with us. And again, it is cumulative, because you had, again, as they say on page 963, the outcome of the increased acquaintance with ethnic cuisine was a more adventurous and daring clientele to be catered to. Once you establish a boundary of the exotic, is that what I want to say? If the culinary tourism impulse is to constantly seek out new tastes, then when the tastes cease to be new and the desire for newness is still there, there is an apparatus that will meet that desire for newness. It's like, oh, okay, well, here you go. You want something new? Here we are. And so it accretes. And individual restaurants change and adapt their menu for their adventurous clientele. And it's not that all clientele are adventurous, but there's clearly a thick enough market for this that these things are viable and adaptable. And that's kind of their argument, and that most of America, or at least enough of America, where America is defined by its thick middle as opposed to its as a multicultural space. But this kind of, again, here's the problem with the article, it's dancing around these issues. Because it's not defining what it means by America at any point. I guess that's the point that I want to raise. But there is sufficient clientele that are looking for adventuresome eating, and so you can go, you can keep on expanding on the level of the restaurant, on the level of new restaurants, new cuisines, and so on. So on the macro and the micro level, there is an adaptation. Increasingly in the 1980s, a trend that you'd already seen in the 1970s was the association of ethnic food with healthy food. And so healthy in two ways. One, in terms of its actual ingredients, in terms of the sort of biological health. This is what we use lean meats, we use natural oils, we will abstain from certain additives that might be commonplace in North American food, and flavorings and so on. They are antithetical to what we talk about. Cool. But also the idea that there is, because they are from an older, a pre-modern, a timeless cuisine tradition, they are somehow much more in tune with the body anyway. So you'll come across things like macrobiotic cooking or macrobiotic diets that are very much Asian influenced because of the notion of sort of harmony and balance. And so there's a metaphorical healthiness in addition to the literal healthiness. And you can make an argument about whether these cuisines are or aren't more healthy until the cows come home. But it is interesting that one of the markers of its healthiness is its stark contrast from North America mainstream industrial complex. So yeah, it's kind of neat. And the one of the things is that culinary tourism as identity work continued. Eating a dish did not necessarily reflect a symbolic identification with the workers so much as intake of exotic flavor into daily life. So I am participating in something. I am not transforming myself into that. I am transforming myself into a more and more worldly person. And then they have their section when they talk about the 1990s, the multicultural ending. The multicultural ending of the 1990s. There's sort of arbitrary line in the sand. And again, we see this pattern where the increased familiarity through restaurant exposure, through travel channels, through cookbooks, apparatus that they don't talk about, which to me is again that idea of when you're only looking at the menu, and you're not taking really at least paying much attention to the temperature of the food discussion outside of the creation of menus, or at least not averting to it in your arguments. You are what you say, which might be true, but it kind of sounds like assumptions, and you don't necessarily give it traction. That people were more familiar, but were they more familiar just by simply going to a whole bunch of restaurants, or were they more familiar because restaurants are just one of the ways that food ethnicity is negotiated, and within that, the menu is just one of the ways that it is negotiated within that particular space? Nevertheless, one can argue, they argue, and I think we can agree that they are most accurate, that by the 1990s, the trend that had started in the late 1970s, perhaps on the coasts, was now fully entrenched, and that there were at least international cuisines, ethnic foods that were so not mainstreamed because they might still be unified, but they were so familiar that the level of description kind of ebbed. You didn't need to assume, you didn't need to introduce it, you didn't need to contextualize it. It was part of the common sense, and you see that in their menus. And so I guess that's probably what they mean by the multicultural ending, and that American cuisine had ceased to be simply this proto-American, European, German, English food from the 1950s and 60s, kind of like, the diner foods and plates. And the common parlance had these foods, had foods from immigrant communities, ethnic foods, so integrated into regular food habits that they are part of the American food. You have to talk about Chinese food, you have to talk about Italian, you have to talk about French, maybe, but you have to talk about Chinese food as American food, as part of the palate. And then these restaurants that are Italian American or Chinese American are part of the grand collection of, they would enter into the big tent that of American restaurants. These ethnic restaurants still exist, I'm guessing, or what they are categorizing as ethnic restaurants that are sort of catering to two groups, catering to the most adventurous eaters of the mainstream, and catering to the immigrant communities that still identify as more as that than as this thick middle. It's so complicated because their terms are so complicated that I worry that I am stepping over myself to try and I'm saying the wrong thing by trying to explain what I think is the right thing, because their terms are so bleh. Yeah, they diss yuppies, which is fine. I have no problem with them dissing yuppies, but again, it's that sort of strange snark and that strange contempt that they have. But I think their point is made that just by looking at menus, you can see that this is now entered into it wholesale. And as even though experimentation and new things do enter into the discussion, and new foods and new food traditions are more and more mainstream, and like, here in Canada, Boston Pizza has Thai bites on its menu, and like we're like, yeah, cool, Thai food, and yeah, but I mean it's indicative of something. It's indicative of our comfort being able to experiment with these foods, that they do not require a huge amount of ongoing contextualization. They have been brought into our larger common sense discussion. And here's the thing that I don't know if it's a typo or not, but this is a genuine question I have. In their conclusion, restaurants as agents of culinary novelties. Sure. I'm just going to read it to you, and then I'm going to give you a look where it says, the reading of American restaurant menus from the 1960s through the 1990s as social texts revealed the role of restaurants in general and ethnic restaurants in particular as agents of culinary novelties. Cool. As such, restaurants have managed both to facilitate hostility and suspicion toward the food of the immigrants, as well as to prevent the latter from challenging basic culinary assumptions to underlie dominant pattern of dining. I don't 100% know what they mean. Are they basically suggesting that this process of mainstreaming foods, it keeps the food of the immigrants at a the actual food of the immigrants, the authentic food of the immigrants, fill in the blank for already problematic, not necessarily because of sort of racial understanding, but problematic in terms of conceptual terms. But, the food that immigrants eat in immigrant restaurants in immigrant neighborhoods, keeps that at arm's reach. While and that's the hostility. Don't go into these deep, dark places to eat this deep, dark food. Come into these restaurants and we will have assimilated the best, the most palatable, the most comprehensible. Is that what they are suggesting? That these restaurants maintain a hostile attitude towards immigrant food, and that's what I don't get. I think that might be their conclusion, and I'm not going to say that they are wrong, but I'm saying that's a bombshell to drop in the conclusion, and they haven't necessarily made their point because, and maybe it's their use of the word agent, that has implied that the whole time, and I had been reading it differently. But American ethnic again their terms, American restaurants, this sort of group of people who are happily taking processes from immigrant communities, taking their food traditions, taking their food habits, and imposing a tradition that is palatable, inventing traditions in terms of in discourse, and presenting it to the wealthier or the mainstream audiences that can sustain a greater market for it. And so, again, simultaneously keeping that in contempt. Hostility towards them. Are restaurants doing that? I don't know. I don't know if it's been proven that they have, and that's because you only have the menu. You don't have ethnographic data. You don't have larger, even like restaurant reviews at the time. You don't have people's memories of restaurants that they're being built on. You only have this. And so they're reading a lot into this text. A text that they are suggesting can speak for itself without any idea of how that text has been interpreted and negotiated by customers, good and bad. I mean, that their reading has been positive or negative about this menu. You just don't know. And is the idea that the more sophisticated clientele are more sophisticated and yet simultaneously maintain their hostility towards the originating cuisines? I don't think that's proven. I guess this is their point. The traditional ethnic restaurant in the ghetto gave way in the 1980s to the mainstream of dining, in which the marriage of two or more culinary traditions in the menu or on one's plate became the norm. In parallel, it legitimized the pseudo-ethnic restaurant and made it available to other than connoisseurs. This did not necessarily indicate a greater tolerance, curiosity, or respect for the immigrants. Rather, it implied an attempt to include them in the American culture by selectively capitalizing on their traditions for the American eating culture. I think that is a legitimate conclusion to reach. I just don't know if it is proven by doing so. It's like, and that's why it's a problematic article. It's an interesting one. And it does reinforce it underlines the importance of looking at menus as texts. What I think it also does is, by accident, is it reinforces the idea that we can't only look at the menu, that we have to look at these within a flow of the negotiation that the actual clientele are doing at the time. And so how is this menu, this artifact, how is it interpreted by readers themselves at that moment, as opposed to 40 years hence? I don't know. Anyway, it's a good article because it raises questions, because it proposes a methodology, because it makes its point suggestively. And it's like, okay, where do we go from here? So the article, once more, is Liora Gvion, and I hope I'm pronouncing that right. I'm presuming I am not. Gvion, perhaps? Liora Gvion. And Naomi Trostler's From Spaghetti and Meatballs Through Hawaiian Pizza to Sushi, The Changing Nature of Ethnicity in American Restaurants. As ever, my friends, I wish you nothing but the best. Be well and eat well, and I will see you later. Bye-bye.